I'm Michael Krasny, and I welcome you to another episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, a weekly podcast of deep dive interviews with national and international authors, journalists, tech and business experts, artists, scientists, entertainers, and opinion shapers. And you can become a member of the podcast by simply going to graymatter.show, and that's gray with an E. We cover a wide range of intellectually engaging and timely topics, distinguished by what we like to believe is a high-level content and technical excellence. Our guest this episode is New York Times op-ed columnist and two-time Pulitzer Prize winner Nick Kristof. His newest book is Chasing Hope, A Reporter's Life, and he's co-author of 5 other books with his wife, Sherilyn Wu Dunn, with whom he was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in 1990 for their coverage of China. The second Pulitzer was in 2006 for his columns on Darfur. He served as Times bureau chief in China, Japan, and Hong Kong. He's a graduate of Harvard, where he edited the Harvard Crimson. He's also a Rhodes Scholar, and his roots go back to working-class boyhood, a farm in Oregon, where he is right now, in fact, joining us from. His family still produce cider from apple orchards there, and his career as a future journalist began in the 8th grade at Yamhill Grade School. He has covered both domestic and international stories across the world throughout a distinguished career, and I welcome Nick Kristof to Gray Matter with Michael Krasny.
Great to be with you, Michael.
Great to be with you again, and I'm going to call you Nick despite the fact what your name means in Arabic. I feel comfortable calling you Nick. Somebody may look that up on Google. Let me congratulate you first on this inspiring book, and the book which really makes me think of Emily Dickinson, The Thing with Feathers That Perches in the Soul. You look at hope, and you give us hope, and you inspire hope despite the fact that you have been to some of the worst places in the world and have observed and witnessed some of the most terrible abominations imaginable from humankind. This is a remarkable book, though. What a life you've had. And I'm grateful for all you've brought into the light as a reporter, as a journalist, about war and poverty and genocide and disease. And in all of that, and despite all that, the hope. You're a journalistic hero. Let me begin by saying that. And you have a great generosity of spirit and commitment to, seeking the truth and to empathy. And as I said, it's an extraordinary life, and you've educated me and so many others. You've changed the world. Did you set out to change the world?
Not at all. And, when the New York Times first hired me, I was writing about exchange rates and oil prices and things like that. And I enjoyed that kind of reporting. But then reporting took me to things that just really shook me and rattled my soul. And in 1989 at Tiananmen Square, I was there in the crowd when the People's Liberation Army opened fire with automatic weapons on that crowd that I was in the middle of. And you can't watch a modern army mow down protesters and not want to fight back with your toolbox. And my toolbox is the journalistic one. And that, I think, made me a little bit more aware of both the oppression and suffering that was going on, and also the extent to which we could use our coverage to try to make a difference and raise the cost of oppression. And, then that led to other kinds of reporting. I did what I thought was going to be one piece about human trafficking, and I was in Cambodia, and I saw very young girls who'd been kidnapped from their homes and were being auctioned off for their virginity. And again, that just shook me to the core. And so I ended up writing a lot about that, initially in Asia, and then that made me wonder about the situation here in the U.S. and so on and so on. And so there hasn't, this was never really part of a strategy. It really was a result of coming across terrible situations that presented me with a moral challenge that I wanted to call attention to these issues. I cared about them, and I wanted readers to care about them too.
Well, you succeeded, and magnificently. And Tiananmen Square was clearly seminal in many ways. It was a turning point because it made you realize there aren't, even as a journalist, there aren't sometimes two sides to issues, but also those guys carrying the rickshaws and the effect they had on you.
Yeah, I mean, I felt badly about that because in the run-up to the Tiananmen massacre, I had been kind of condescending about some of the protesters from the countryside and the workers and the peasants. And I said, they say they're for democracy, but they can't really define what kind of democracy they want. And that was true. But that terrible night at Tiananmen it was the workers who were the great heroes. And so, in particular, there was a convoy of trucks coming in to Tiananmen Square of soldiers to crush the protesters. And then there was a bus driver, ordinary salt-of-the-earth bus driver, who parked his bus across the road to block them. And the convoy of trucks had to grind to a halt. An officer got out and ordered the bus driver to move. And he parked the bus, he pulled out the keys, he turned it off, and he stepped out and he refused to move it. And the officer pointed his sidearm at the bus driver and said, "Move the bus." And the bus driver at that point took the keys and hurled them into the high grass by the side of the road where the troops wouldn't find them. And, I think about that guy. He could not have defined democracy, but he was willing to risk his life for it. And I do think that in this country, we often take for granted the democracy that we've inherited, and we have failed to fight as valiantly for democracy as those Chinese I saw that terrible night.
Yeah, it was an extraordinary story, and reminded me, of course, about that one man who stood against the tanks, too, in Tiananmen Square. But when you speak about sex trafficking and your experiences in Cambodia, and you had done some investigating of that in other places in the world, these children sold off for virginity and so forth, it just brings to mind the terrible exploitation of children. And this is something that has particularly gotten into your gut. I mean, as a reporter and as a journalist, the suffering and the exploitation and oppression of children.
Yeah, and, I think, partly it's that I think, the suffering of children always moves us more. Their innocence and so on. But I think it's also partly a function of what has happened in my hometown here in rural Oregon. And, good jobs went away, and then meth arrived. And so at this point, more than a third of the kids on my old school bus are gone from drugs, alcohol, and suicide. And many of them not only suffered greatly, but inflicted great suffering on others. And I think about what would have made a difference for my friends who have died. And I think it is so often interventions while they were kids. And that too often, whether abroad or at home, we try to intervene too late. And we help adults who have already struggling with addiction or with homelessness. And, the time to help, what is most effective, is in early childhood when people are wrestling with trauma, when they're falling behind in school. And so I just think both at a moral level and a practical level, we would be so much better off trying to do more to support children, both here and abroad.
Well, you never forgot where you came from. That's come across in your work as well. And you're still there now, in fact, as we speak. But your parents have a very prominent role in this new book of yours. And you write about them as highly moral people. Your father was a refugee. Your mother was a Quaker. It was an amazing kind of combination and its impact on you and shaping you, effect on you. But you go back and you highlight the lives of these kids on your bus, as you call them, and the sort of lives that they were led into. And those could have been changed.
And it's, the 5 kids who got on the school bus right after me each morning were the nap kids. Farland was the oldest. He was my grade, really smart kid, very capable. And the family had really thrived through economic opportunity and upward mobility for years. When Farland turned 16, his family got him a Ford Mustang, and I was so jealous. But then, because jobs went away, because there wasn't much emphasis on education, and those old 5 kids dropped out, so Farland died of liver failure from drug and alcohol abuse. His brother Zeelan died in a house fire when he was passed out drunk. Their brother Nathan blew himself up cooking meth. Their sister Regina died of hepatitis from IV drug use. And their baby brother Keelan, he had survived basically because he was in the Oregon State Penitentiary for 11 years. But then he was released, and at the beginning of the pandemic, he overdosed and died. And, their mom is still alive in her 80s and walks up the hill each day to visit the graves of her 5 dead children. And I that is not the story of one school bus or one community. That is the story of so much of working class America. And a country can't thrive when so many of its people are being left behind.
Well, you've also brought to public attention in ways that I think no one else has, the struggles in Africa. When I was in school in Ohio, we heard of this continent as the Dark Continent, and there really wasn't much attention from journalists. You came along and made us highly aware of Darfur and struggles that were going on throughout the continent. I'm just wondering about something that you brought to our attention in your book. There was an article about Brett Kavanaugh that you did that got 7 times the hits that article you did at the time, I guess, was about Yemen.
Yeah, that one was about Yemen. Yeah,
the greatest humanitarian crisis that we have now, right? And it becomes kind of unfortunately, a way of looking at what journalism doesn't do because the people don't respond to it in the way that you would hope they would.
Yeah, I mean that is the big challenge, and in general, it's not just Americans, but Europeans as well. Japanese as well. We retreat. We are suffering from compassion fatigue. And meanwhile, there are enormous global crises. Sudan is on the precipice of what may be one of the worst famines of our lifetime. And you look at Myanmar falling apart in similar ways. Haiti is in crisis. Obviously, the Middle East. And Gaza is getting some attention, Ukraine getting some attention. But everything else has just disappeared. Ethiopia had a horrific humanitarian disaster and war in the Tigray area. Hundreds of thousands appear to have been killed, and it got almost no attention. 100,000 women raped, again, almost no attention. And so I think, we in journalism have to do a better job trying to cover these crises, because if they don't get covered, they don't get addressed. You only, the leaders around the world are only going to try to invest resources to address problems if they're being nagged by the public, including journalists. And, the problem is that there isn't really a good business model to cover these humanitarian crises. And a television network can send a crew off to cover what is happening in Sudan, but it's expensive. It's dangerous, and their ratings will fall compared to a rival network that puts a Democrat and a Republican in a studio together and has them yell at each other. And so, that is the conundrum in which we find ourselves. And I do think that we in journalism, we mostly entered this profession because we wanted to serve the public good, and that we do have some obligation to not just do the kind of reporting that is going to be profitable, but also that which is important for the public good and the public interest. And that does mean doing a better job covering these crises, both global and domestic.
Well, you're also an excellent storyteller, and journalism is still an art of storytelling, but it's also, as you point out, an act of hope. That's your kind of lead here in this book.
Why go to Yemen during that civil war? Or why sneak into Sudan to cover the Darfur genocide? It's fundamentally because you think that reporting can make a difference and can save lives. And in that respect, it is an act of hope. And we in journalism, we have this reputation for being cynics, and I think we often try to cultivate it ourselves. We're kind of the grouchy cynics, but you scratch a journalist, and it is an idealist who bleeds. I mean, I think what draws us into this is the idea that coverage matters, and it does change the world. And I've seen that. I saw that in Darfur. I saw that with sex trafficking. I've seen that in other areas. And that creates a real responsibility for us to...
But idealists can so easily become cynics. I mean, I've seen it happen too many times. Or they can make themselves overly vulnerable, overly invulnerable. And yet this has not been a problem for you. I mean, you have had problems, which you write about. I mean, PTSD type of problems and so forth. I mean, just the anguish that you've witnessed and everything has to get into your insides.
Absolutely.
But, you've restored the sense of hope and stoked it.
Yeah. And, I think part of that is that, people always ask me, how can you cover war and genocide and poverty and, emerge feeling vaguely optimistic about humanity? And I think part of it is that while we tend to cover all the things that are going terribly wrong and all the suffering, side by side with the worst of humanity, you invariably find the very best. And you find these incredible heroes who are out in the field and risking their lives to help other people. And in the U.S., we're not tested in the same way. We don't have warlords rampaging around, so we don't see how magnificent human beings can be. But it turns out that when we, as a species, are fully challenged, sure, some of us turn out to be awful and kill others, but some of us turn out to be just magnificent and step up to the challenge and rescue those around them. And it is incredible what we are capable of.
And you do what Steven Pinker does. You point out all the progress that's been made, too, that people really need to be mindful of.
Yeah, there's when you ask people in polls about the direction of global poverty, so 80 to 90% say that it is getting worse or staying the same. And in fact, Michael, as you know, one of the great transformations of our lifetimes has been an extraordinary reduction in global poverty and suffering. When I was born, 1/5 of all children died before the age of 5. When I graduated from college, it was 11%. Now we're down to 3%, and it's still way too many. But boy, is that an improvement. When we were children, a majority of human beings had always been illiterate throughout human history. And now we're pushing 90% adult literacy. That's when people can read, that's transformative. There are more mobile phones now around the world than there are toilets, which is good for communications. Says something else about sanitation. But this backdrop of progress, I think, is very real. And I think, while jumping up and down about the problems, we also have to acknowledge that backdrop of progress.
I just don't know what the mobile phones are doing to our neural pathways, but that's another subject for another day, probably. Wondering, Jimmy Carter recently passed away, and, he was someone I had the privilege of interviewing a number of times, certainly a great humanitarian and a man of wisdom and compassion and believing in human rights. And you write about him favorably, as I would expect. And then you write about Trump, and you write about him as a deceitful, pathological liar and so forth. What goes through your mind when you compare these two presidents?
Oh boy, I'm a huge admirer of Carter, and not just because of what he did in his post-presidency, although that was tremendous, and he, one of the shames of the world is that he told me repeatedly that he wanted to eradicate guinea worm before he died. He wanted to see the end of it before it saw the end of him. And he probably didn't succeed. There were, I think, 14 cases of guinea worm in the last full year was counted. But, there were 3 million cases when he started. He had unbelievable success against neglect diseases. But he also, I think, during his presidency, did more than is acknowledged in terms of returning the Panama Canal, in terms of the Camp David peace agreement.
Excuse me, Trump seems to be after the Panama Canal again.
Yeah, and trying to undo that. But I think he had a better presidency than is generally acknowledged. And he
brokered a peace in the Middle East.
Yeah, absolutely. And he put solar panels on the White House. He brought human rights into the national discussion. And meanwhile, I think Trump had a worse presidency than the public acknowledges. I think we came closer to war with North Korea, for example, than is generally recognized. But it does. I've been distressed by the way my world of liberals tends to blame Trump voters. And I think it's important to distinguish between Trump and Trump voters. And I can understand how working class Americans who are, who've seen their communities unravel, who have lost 100,000 people a year to overdoses, why they are desperate for something different. And I think it has been a mistake for too many people on the left to suggest that every Trump voter is a racist and a bigot, both because I think we should be wary of mass labels, but more broadly, it's really hard to win the votes of people whom you're accusing of being racist and bigots. I think that Trump will fail, and I hope that will mean a return to the kind of politics that I admire. But I also think that we can't just spend the next 4 years denouncing Trump, and that we have to do a much better job improving the areas where we control, the blue areas. And, the West Coast, for example, has a real problem, I think. And I think the problems in our cities help elect Republicans elsewhere in the country.
Well, it's one of the reasons you threw your hat in the ring and decided to run at one point for governor of Oregon. I think you would have been probably a very good governor, a very progressive governor. I use that word advisedly because it's being overused in kind of an Orwellian way. But the Secretary of State kind of put the kibosh on all that.
She did.
I mean, resentment in you for that? Or do you feel you kind of missed the opportunity that was there? Or how do you feel about it now?
I mean, the joke in our house is that my wife, Cheryl, was probably calling up the Secretary of State and encouraging her to boot me out of the race. It ended in a belly flop when the Secretary of State did push me out. She said that I did not qualify under the residency requirement. I obviously thought that was ridiculous. We'd had lawyers who had examined this ad nauseum and thought that was ridiculous. She obviously disagreed. She was then forced to resign in a corruption scandal not long afterward. That
must have felt good in some ways, didn't it?
Oh, I mean, there is a little glimmer of karma in there, but it's also, corruption scandals aren't good for any place, especially when the state is struggling. And I just think that up and down the West Coast, from Seattle through Portland, through San Francisco, through Los Angeles, we've got, real problems with homelessness, with drugs, and we've got to do a better job addressing our own problems. When I was running for governor, it'd be kind of funny. I was trying to get Democratic votes in the primary, of course, and so I'd be meeting groups of Democratic donors, and in, say, Portland, and the natural impulse in a primary campaign like that is to say how awful the Republicans are, and that's kind of what people were expecting me to say and what people wanted me to say. And meanwhile, we're all nervous about whether our catalytic converters are being stolen outside. And I kept thinking, we just can't blame Republicans on this mess because there aren't any Republicans in Portland. This is our mess. We created this, and we've got to fix it. And that's a hard message to talk about, though, in a Democratic primary.
There are a lot of messes in Democrat-run cities now. I mean, that give the Republicans a good deal more grist for their own fuel and give them some advantages, I would assert. But at any rate, I was interested in what you were saying about the woke movement, and I wanted to touch on that with you because you went to Harvard on a kind of affirmative action. You were a rural farm boy, and they wanted to have somebody from that background. And there's always been this argument, and I got in the middle of it in many instances, should we be giving more attention to those who come from the working class as opposed to just the basis being color? Because sometimes rich kids of color go on the basis of their melanin or their pigment or whatever, and kids who are really impoverished or part of the working class don't. And so where do you stand, class and race?
So I think that we on the left tend to be very alert to opportunity gaps that are based on race and ethnicity, as we should be. I mean, you can't talk about poverty and opportunity without acknowledging the role of race. You just can't. But you also can't have a serious conversation about opportunity and poverty without talking about class and about parental education, about family structure. And we've tended, I think, not to be willing to have those kinds of conversations about class, about family structure. And we need to. They overlap. And there are an awful lot of people of color who were also from working class backgrounds who, have two kinds of blows against them. But I think that we haven't been as willing and to talk about class as we have about race.
Agreed. And we've got a lot of questions coming in. Let me at least go to some of the questions that are coming in here. One of them was about Jimmy Carter's passing from Trish in Miami, and wanted to know if you ever got to work with him.
Yeah, I a number of times on topics from the Middle East to mental health to all kinds of the global election issues. And when he was making his staff reached out to me and said he was making his last big foreign trip to Africa to look at guinea worm disease and river blindness. And they asked if I wanted to go with him. And I thought, okay, Jimmy Carter's last big foreign trip. Okay, I need to do that. And so I'm with him. We're in a village in southern Ethiopia in the middle of nowhere besides a creek where he's eradicated river blindness. And we do a little video interview. And I say, Mr. President Carter, I understand this is your last big foreign trip. And I wonder how. Then he interrupts and say, last foreign trip? Whatever would give you that idea? And he looks around and his staff is like, looking away. And it was clear that he meant to be making these big foreign trips for the next 100 years or more. And I just loved him for that. I mean, this sense of commitment to go these remote places and, address these diseases that were hurting vast numbers of people and that even their own country's rulers were often indifferent to. He was, he had this profound empathy and this enormous determination to try to solve what might have seemed insoluble issues, whether they were Middle East peace or whether they were guinea worm disease.
Well, as much as I admired and respected President Carter and had very good rapport with him, there was a kind of off moment, call it a contretemps. I was trying to give him an opportunity to respond to someone who is not held in high esteem by people like us anymore, as he once was, Alan Dershowitz, who went after him and said that he was a tool of Saudi Foundation and was essentially helping to advance anti-Semitic kinds of, shall we say, goals. It was unfair, and I thought it was unfair, but just for bringing it up, this is a danger that journalists often face. Even for bringing something up with the best of intentions, it can come back to you like that did. And I mention it with you because there's been a lot of criticism from Dershowitz also of someone we both admire and have had good experiences with, and that's Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who has also been branded by Dershowitz an anti-Semite. I don't want to necessarily get into an ad hominem with Dershowitz here, but the other thing that I would be curious to get your response on along these lines is the New York Times, ironically, maybe because there were so many Jewish people in power positions, including the Sulzbergers, who were people you admired and revered, I think, and certainly got along with very well. The argument went that they were really too harsh on Israel, anti-Semitic, because they wanted to show that they were even-handed, even though they were Jewish.
Yeah, well, maybe not surprisingly, I don't buy that at all. And, I think the idea, to take Jimmy Carter for an example, to take, the idea that Carter was anti-Jewish when it was his dedication to diplomacy that achieved the Camp David Agreement and ultimately helped, kind of assure by bringing Egypt and Israel together, he essentially assured Israel's long-term success. And, likewise, Desmond Tutu, really, a guy who was heroic on so many fronts, whether it was apartheid, whether it was reconciliation afterward, including with the large Jewish community in South Africa, who was so vigilant against homophobia, against xenophobia. And I guess more broadly on the anti-Semitism question. So one of the things that I came to feel after October 7th was that there really was more anti-Semitism within the liberal world than I had anticipated and expected. And I think after October 7th on university campuses, you saw real statements and behaviors that made me think, this is a deeper problem on the left than I'd anticipated. And yet, I also think so often the accusation of anti-Semitism is directed at ways that squander its moral power. And it's used against people who criticize Israeli misconduct in Gaza or in the West Bank when that Israeli behavior deserves to be criticism. I mean, it deserves criticism. I think what Israel has done in Gaza is horrifying. And the same, in many ways, what settlers are doing in the West Bank.
Is Gaza now, it's being called a genocide? Is it what you deem to be a genocide?
I avoid the word genocide. I'll leave that to lawyers to worry about. And there's also a difference between what the 1948 Genocide Convention uses as a definition and what we tend to use in popular parlance. And the courts have required demonstrations of intent that are hard to prove. So I leave that to the international lawyers. I don't use the word genocide there. But, there have been vast numbers of children killed. The rules of engagement in Gaza, I think, have been very lax. And their food and water and healthcare products have been deeply limited by Israel going into Gaza in ways that have compounded the misery and suffering there of innocents. And so, is anti-Semitism a real problem? Absolutely. Is that term often used in a way that is inappropriate and against people who are making justified criticisms? Absolutely as well.
Well, you did cover genocide in Darfur. That was a genocide. You've covered genocide in Myanmar. That's a genocide. In Rwanda, that was a genocide. But it's a word that's been very difficult to really calibrate and quantify, hasn't it?
That's right. And, so it seems to me that Darfur, Rwanda, and I would say Myanmar against the Rohingya are genocides, beyond a doubt, where there were these real systematic efforts to wipe out people from a certain area. But meanwhile, we also tend to think of Cambodia by Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge as a genocide. And it's, in that case, people were slaughtered on the basis not of their ethnicity or race, but on the basis of education. And education is not a traditional criterion for genocide under the Genocide Convention. So, is that a genocide? There's ambiguity in the terminology that I think we don't always acknowledge. And too often it becomes I think the term genocide too often becomes kind of a weapon rather than, and obscures more than it clarifies.
And used too loosely and promiscuously. On the other hand, I remember interviewing a Turkish ambassador and talking about the Armenian genocide, and his arguing vehemently that it's not a genocide, not by these standards or those standards and so forth. So it gets kind of, let me go to some more questions, a lot of questions for you. I'll get to as many as I can. And let me thank Bill from Boston, who wants to know, how do you gauge the impact of your reporting on the issues you cover? And do you ever feel frustration about the pace of change?
Oh, I feel deep frustration about the pace of change all the time. And, I go out and report on these things, and just so often it finds like it's disappearing without a ripple. And, we talked about Yemen, and, Yemen was the world's worst humanitarian crisis at that point, according to the UN. And it was so hard to cover. And then I'd come back and write my pieces. And as you mentioned, a Brett Kavanaugh column that I wrote at my desk in an afternoon got 7 times as many page views as the Yemen reporting.
That's frustrating.
Oh, it's so frustrating. But I also think that we sometimes misperceive in journalism where our influence lies. And, if I write a anti-Trump column or a column on guns or abortion or whatever, then people who are like-minded will come up and say, "Oh, Nick, that was a great column, brilliantly said," and so on. But I don't think I actually change anybody's mind with those columns. And in contrast, when I do write a Yemen column or sometimes a sex trafficking column or whatever, then I do think that I can help project issues onto the agenda. And once that issue is on the agenda, it kind of, it forces people to read and maybe spill their coffee a little bit and is one step toward getting some progress. And so I think that our power in journalism is less having people change their minds on topics they thought about, which is really hard, and more about that power to put issues on the agenda, including difficult, painful, wrenching issues.
One thing that you say, which really had me mulling a good deal about, because you get into a lot of the nuances and the paradoxes and so forth, is put humans ahead of journalism, put humanity. And when you get into a question, in fact, you've been steadfast about trying to tell the truth as a journalist. I think this, you say the only time you lie, maybe, or the only time one should lie is when one is face to face with a, shall we say, a warlord. But that idea of sticking to the truth and adhering to the truth and trying to be, almost orthodox about the adherence to the truth in the face of so many struggles that take you in different directions and show the multidimensional nature of evil, for example. It makes it very tough.
It does. I mean, one of the things I tried to do in Chasing Hope was talk about some of the ethical challenges that I faced, and, including like when you lie. And indeed, to save a life, you absolutely lie. We're in the truth business. But if you're being held by a warlord in Congo, then you lie through your teeth and say you have the Uber warlord's permission to be there. And maybe the most difficult ethical challenge I faced was when we were in China, and there was a young man who had helped us cover the Tiananmen democracy movement. And partly because of that, he was imprisoned. He escaped from prison. And then he came to Beijing and asked Cheryl and me for help fleeing China. And it's a pretty basic rule of being a foreign correspondent that you don't help an escaped felon flee the country. But he's a 19-year-old guy who has already been imprisoned because he helped New York Times readers. And if we didn't help him, at some point he was going to get caught and terrible things would have happened. And I just searched my conscience for my obligations to him, my obligations to the New York Times. If we were caught, we might have been imprisoned. The New York Times Bureau might have been closed. We were surely breaking New York Times policy if we helped him. But in the end, we did help him. And he was able to get with our help, to Hong Kong and then to the U.S. And it was probably the most unprofessional thing I ever did, but also one that I'm proudest of.
Well, sometimes, like T.S. Eliot said, you can do the right thing for the wrong reason or the wrong thing for the right reason, and it's hard sometimes to distinguish. Here's Harriet from Pittsburgh, though, who says, right on point here to some extent, how do you navigate cultural sensitivity and respect while covering stories in diverse parts of the world?
So, that comes up kind of in all kinds of ways. And I'm always very conscious of the fact that I'm parachuting in. I don't often, if it's in many places, I don't speak the language. I don't have a deep knowledge of culture and civilization. And I may be being judgmental about, the treatment of girls, about female genital mutilation, about trafficking, about all kinds of issues. But I'm also conscious of the fact that, my wife, Cheryl, is Chinese American. And when she's asked about cultural imperialism, she always notes that her grandmother's feet were bound. And she says, thank God there were Westerners pressing China to end foot binding, or later generations might have had their feet bound. And so I think that while we need to balance respect for other cultures and humility about our own understanding of foreign cultures with some sense of the universality of human rights and the idea that girls should be able to go to school and should not be cut in ways that endanger them, and that, parents do not have the right to traffic their kids, and so on and so on. But trying to balance that and navigate that is always hard. And it's got to start with some real sense of humility on our part and a recognition of how often we screw up in these kind of judgments. I always think that, we have this obligation on the one hand to take moral stances and to call them as we see them. But if that is mitigated by also the humility that we screw up so often, that somewhat reduces the tendency to be a finger-wagging, sanctimonious moralist. And that finger-wagging moralism never really is very effective in changing anybody's mind anyway.
Well, you're right about the criticism of so-called white saviors, and I was very struck by that with examples like James Barnett, is it? And Gerald McNeil.
Yeah.
I was also thinking about Paul Farmer, who I had immense respect for and everything. But the idea that these people should be criticized because of the fact that they have white skin when they're doing such extraordinary things in so many instances and really helping people and being moral about it.
Yeah, and the big problem has not been too much compassion from white people for people of color. I know that has not been the global problem. It has been too little compassion and empathy for people of different complexions, and that's why we went to war in Bosnia or Kosovo to prevent genocides, but not in Rwanda or Darfur. And so anything we can do to try to build empathy for people across ethnic or racial lines, I think is fundamentally a good thing.
And Kerry from San Diego says, what's your view on the impact of AI on global progress?
I've thought a lot about this. I wonder a lot about it. And I'm a little ambivalent. I've written about some areas where AI in pornography, I think, for example, is deeply harmful. And yet I also see applications in education where it can really improve education and literacy and lower costs. And I guess I'm also skeptical of any idea that we can freeze AI. I think bad actors will continue with it. So I think we want to win the war of AI.
Genie's out of the bottle.
I think the genie's out of the bottle, and that China is going to continue to develop it. This is a effort we want to be ahead on. But I also think we do need to make sure that governance over AI is real. I don't entirely trust the private sector to do the right thing with AI models. And so I think that, outside scrutiny and governance is really important. And I guess fundamentally, I think back to every platform that's ever been around since Gutenberg and movable type and then the internet, that these present new opportunities for improving human well-being and improving a lot of humanity, but also lead to screeds and oppression and empower autocrats. And we just have to acknowledge this difficult balance and do what we can to put our fingers on the scale to help the useful applications and impede and regulate the harmful ones.
Well, despite all these advances, I came away from your book with the reinforced sense that basic journalism is still basic journalism. I mean, it's storytelling, it's identification with different causes, it's bringing them forward, it's in providing light, all the kinds of things that really have made up your career.
Don't you think, Michael, that, so much of what we do now, whether in interviews or with articles, is basically the same as what Homer was doing almost 3,000 years ago, and that it's storytelling. And, Homer he didn't do a play-by-play of the whole Trojan War. He chose a period and chose characters and invested those characters with, this conflicts and so on. And, that was great storytelling. And I think that some of the tools that he used in that craft are essentially the way we tell stories today.
Yeah, I think it really hasn't metamorphosed in so many ways as many of us assume because of all the technology and all the changes that we've been through. It's still pretty basic. Also wondering about your sense of when you do journalistic work. You mentioned Janet Malcolm a couple of times, and I talked to a number of journalists through the years about Janet Malcolm, who I interviewed a couple of times. And you even touch on this in a different way. You're aware of the fact that sometimes you have to be dissembling. You want to shake hands with people that you interview. You want to make a kind of human connection with them. But it's for a purpose. It's for sometimes a purpose of getting information, really.
Yeah. And, I'm always wondering when, if North Korea collapses and the North Korean files open up, then somebody's going to find all these letters from me appealing to North Koreans for visas over the years, and these very flattering letters about how I want to cover their success in this or that, and I'll be very embarrassed.
Well, they'll find love letters from Donald Trump too. So.
Yeah, that too. But do we sometimes manipulate sources and try to charm them and win them over? Absolutely. Is there a fine line? I mean, I try not to. I certainly don't lie to people that I'm reaching out to, but do I make a case that is sometimes one-sided? Yes. On the other hand, I and other journalists aren't doing that for enrichment, for advancement, the way a business negotiator might. We're doing that, hopefully, because we're trying to bring more information to the public. And
there's so many people calling themselves journalists now, though. I mean,
well, that's totally true. That is totally true. And I mean, good journalism has rarely been better than it is today, but bad journalism, in air quotes, boy, it is pretty awful. And I think it's also, I don't know what you think about this, but I think there's been a drift toward opinion journalism and toward shouting that even as an opinion journalist myself, I find a little sad. And I think that where we in journalism add the most value is with our reporting. And when we bring new facts to the table, when we add something to the soup. And I think a lot of people today in the journalism world are stirring the soup rather than adding to it. And they're doing more shouting. They're in the heating business more than the lighting business. I think that in journalism, we do best when we're fundamentally in the lighting business.
It's also clickbait, too. I mean, you get more readers, you get more listeners or viewers when you go to the clickbait. And the problem with that is that young people are so hooked on social media that I don't know that they're just really even getting the depth. I mean, this is me sort of pandering my own opinions here, but the idea that you can provide depth and people will get light from that depth is at the very core of the work that you do and the work I like to think that I did for many years and still do. But it's hard. And in fact, at one point you say, be as skeptical of victims as of perpetrators. Let's flesh that out a little bit. What do you mean by that?
So I think that was one of the lessons I learned at Tiananmen. And I was outraged at the government for slaughtering protesters. But I was also very meticulous about counting the dead. And our estimate was that 400 to 800 people had been murdered by the government at Tiananmen, and say in Beijing. And pretty soon there were all these reports that many, many thousands had been killed. In some cases, many tens of thousands had been killed. That Tiananmen Square was knee deep in blood, this kind of thing. And I just knew that was not true. I'd been in Tiananmen Square. And so what I saw was that when people see a terrible thing and they're outraged, then they lie. And we expect the perpetrators to lie. We know that they're SOBs, but we don't expect victims to lie. And that we as journalists, if we're going to convey the truth, we need to be as skeptical of victims as we are perpetrators. And that's hard to do when you're sympathetic with people who've been oppressed and been victimized. But we need to do that if we're trying to advance the truth. And I've seen that in other contexts as well. I saw that in every genocide, the victims lie too. And it's natural. Like you've seen these terrible things and then you convey maybe what you heard happen and you say that you saw it yourself, or you exaggerate the numbers. That's how people try to fight back. But as journalists, we're in the truth business, not in the sympathy business. And we've got to try to press people for confirmation, for visual evidence, and be very, very careful about maintaining that skepticism, even about very good people who suffered.
Well, like you, I'm appalled by the death and the decimation of the population in Gaza and what's happened. at the same time that I'm well aware that these figures that are coming out from Hamas, and they're obviously inflated. And there's a Henry Jackson group that's done pretty good counting and quantifying, and they've shown on many occasions that a man would be killed and would be put down as a child and that sort of thing. The numbers are just inflated.
Yeah, actually, so I think that there was evidence of that in the middle section of the war. I think that now that is less clear. I don't know what to make of the numbers, but there's also an argument by some epidemiologists that because the health ministry figures in Gaza, they count people killed by the war, and they don't count people who whatever have strokes and can't get hospital care or things that those numbers are being missed, even though they are, in other contexts, we count the surplus mortality and that if those would tend to raise the figures. So I just don't know what to make of the Gaza mortality figures. One way or the other.
I don't either.
I just don't know.
I know I don't trust Hamas, though.
That's true. Yeah, and Hamas was, I reported in Gaza repeatedly before October 7th, and Hamas was, they were brutal, nasty people, and they oppressed Palestinians. They were misogynist, homophobic, very oppressive people. On the other hand, there have been a ton of kids, including very young kids, who've been killed in Gaza, and they are not Hamas. I don't think there is a moral equivalence between Hamas and Israel. I do think that there is a moral equivalence between a Palestinian child in Gaza and a Jewish child in Israel and an American child here in the U.S. And that moral equivalence of those children is something that I think we've too often lost.
Well said. And here's Sam from Emeryville, California, who says, based on your experiences, it's a good question to conclude with, although I wanted to bring up a few other things. But he says, what do you see as the future challenges and opportunities for journalists?
I think the next 4 years, we've got to do a better job truth squatting President Trump. And I think that's not just going to be covering, the daily crisis over what he says or who he appoints, but more broadly looking at peoples and groups that have been issues that have been neglected. Like right now, we have this question of avian flu, and it's very hard to gauge how serious that risk is. But it seems that there is some real risk of another pandemic, and I just can't believe that having gone through one terrible pandemic so recently, that we seem so poorly prepared for another possible pandemic. And uncertainty is all around us. I don't think there's much point in being dogmatic about how to assess that risk. But is there some concern there? Absolutely. And I think we in journalism have to do a better job, not just looking at what happened yesterday, but also looking ahead at the risks of what may happen down the road, and not just highlighting problems, but also at engaging in what we call solutions journalism, looking at some steps toward addressing these problems.
Yeah, I love that idea of solutions journalism, and you bring it up in the book as well. In fact, there's just so much richness in this book. I'm inclined to say that what you say about making the ineffable effable is right on target here, too. That's what journalists still are challenged with doing. And we are an amazing species, as you say as well. I mean, you come back to this hope. The cover of your book says it all, with your arms up in the air and that spirit that you really possess for so many of us who are serious readers of yours.
Thank you.
It's been an extraordinary career in life, and I don't mean to sound like I'm giving you an obituary here. I'm just giving you...
That's one challenge for writing a memoir, that it kind of feels like, okay, now is the time to disappear from the scene.
Yeah, exactly right. I wrote mine too many years ago, and should kind of revalue and do it now, or was it a little bit too early for that? But to say that you've made your mark is an understatement, and I thank you for that. I have a lot of gratitude for the work that you've done, and it's managed to shine so much light. So it's been both a privilege and an honor to be in conversation with you. And you end up talking about our mutual friend, David Brooks, in terms of resumes and eulogies. And I think resumes look awfully good, but the eulogy is what really matters.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you, Michael, for this conversation. It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you for all you've done, and thank you for this conversation as well. And thanks to all who joined us for this episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny. You can hear us on Apple and Spotify, and go to our website, graymatter.show. I invite you to join by going to the website, graymatter.show. You can find previous episodes there, and that's Gray with an E. Also invite you to mail any reactions or suggestions you might have to me at mkrasny@graymatter.show. Thanks to our Gray Matter with Michael Krasny team of Alex, Shannon, Chad, Kevin, Jeff, Colleen, Tanya, and Lori. And a special thanks to this week's guest, Nick Kristof. I'm Michael Krasny.
Bandwidth for Gray Matter is provided by CashFly at CACHEFLY.com.